Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello. Our conversation this evening comes from Anne Leslie, the journalist, Nicholas Tucker, lecturer in psychology at Sussex University, Michael O'Donnell, resident physician, and Laurie Taylor, professor of sociology at York University. We have music from Instant Sunshine. I was rather pleased when that doctor laid into the muesli belt mob and told them all those wholesome pulses were a prescription for starvation. As a sausage, chips and beans man myself, I'm in a chronic state of fear and guilt, and it was really rather nice to see the goodies wearing the black hat for once. Muesli belt seemed awfully apt, conjuring up an image of some whole wheat accessory, which, while it would hold up your trousers, could also be eaten if you strayed into some desolate tundra, say Uxbridge, and could find no health food shop. Yes, very satisfactory. Next week, bicycles will be found to be wicked, and my cup will run over.
Well, you're quite right when you talk about chronic self-guilt. I think chronic self-guilt is behind a lot of the muesli munching in this country. And I remember a friend of mine who'd been a bangers and mash man, much like your good self, Squire, and I hadn't seen him for some time, and he got married and went down to live in the country, and I happened to be in that area, and he'd said, "Oh, pop in and see us." I did. And they had become muesli belt people. And it was all sort of whole wheat baklava and, that kind of bread that tastes like cow pats. And I said to him, "Don't you miss meat occasionally?" And his wife then said, "No, he doesn't at all, because, you see, Tony now realizes that he should feel very guilty about the way he screwed up the whole protein chain of the world." And he was thrilled because he felt enormously guilty, and he enjoyed that almost as much, I think, as eating meat.
I suspect that most people around here are really muesli belt members, and that they delight in seeing...
If it'll fit your thesis, we will say yes.
No, but you delight in finding a small, rather worrying aspect of your own personality which you can project onto another group and declare it to be nothing to do with
Bit of a psychologist on the quiet, aren't you?
all the people around here, I think, are the people who enjoy a little bit of roughage in their life. And that's what this is about, really. The metaphor is roughage, the idea that there ought to be a little bit of grit in the Vaseline, that really you should stop the car just short of the picnic spot, that you should have a walk before or after eating, deferred gratification, wait till Christmas Day for your presents, and all sorts of other varieties of self-denial. And that's what the muesli belt is really about, the fact that life shouldn't be pleasant and one should have a little bit of guilt and a little bit of hard work.
I'm with you, Laurie, because Anne has got the guilt on the wrong side. I'm an unashamed eater of muesli, and just because I don't turn up in caftan and hand-woven sandals and Save the Whales T-shirt, you don't quite include me in the muesli belt. I don't think you need to do this. I think these caricatures are created to assuage other people's guilt. I mean, we muesli eaters don't dress up no more than porridge eaters wear long kilts and look like Russ Abbott.
Although I think we all share this, well, I certainly eat muesli, there is a difference between the fundamentalist muesli eater and the sort of the Church of England type of muesli eater. And I just invite you to take this scene. You approach a very fundamentalist muesli eater. When you get to their house, it's very dark inside because the windows are covered in protest posters. You go in and there's a noise of a child practicing the Suzuki violin. This will be at any time of the day because the children don't go to school. They're educated at home. And now I do think, Michael, that these people aren't caricatures. There are a few, but I mean, so few it's not really worth making a point about them.
What you're doing is very neatly there, Nicholas, if I may say so, refreshing the stereotypes. I mean, I don't believe that they all live in Hampstead and wear caftans and sandals. I think that's all gone. However, the sort of child you just referred to, a friend of mine has a splendid name for. He calls them free-range children.
I thought that Nicholas was going to distinguish between fundamentalist and Church of England muesli eaters on the grounds of the sort of muesli that they had. On whether or not, in fact, all the ingredients are separately assembled, much as though one was making a casserole or a goulash or, a curry, and all gradually added together until the bowl consists of this solid, cement of muesli rather than those people who have it already mixed, or at least half already mixed. It seems to me that is a fundamental
You're quite
distinction.
right, because the fundamentalist muesli is hand knitted, really. And
No, it contains
it's
38 articles.
Yes, and it is entirely, it's hamster food, as my daughter told me, because I actually have a little bit of muesli in my soul, I must admit. And I went off to a health store and got one of these hand-knitted mueslis, and my daughter said, well, I don't think Wuzzle would eat this. It's hamster food, and not very good hamster food. But she likes that kind of ersatz Church of England muesli, which comes in a packet from Kellogg's and which is covered with sort of apple-cheeked farmers and things, which is totally ersatz. And she loves it. It's full of sugar for a
Maybe
start.
if we called it something else, people would enjoy. I mean, I
I know what we can call it, wallpaper.
No,
because it has a distinct flavour of unreconstituted wallpaper paste. But it's quite nice after
No,
that.
it's so pretty. It's got
wear
bits
off.
of pebble in it.
The reason
Brown
that
man yourself.
Brand man, yes.
well,
but
then
that's for my ingrowing toenail. Medical reasons, Squire, medical reasons.
But George Gershwin, I mean, he should have had. You know, he was psychoanalyzed for his constipation, which he didn't very much. This business of calling it music and sort of healthy eating saddens me, because I mean, I think healthy eating is quite fun since I took it up. And I remember
Well,
when
you advertised it the whole time. You would, wouldn't
when
you?
we started the BBC health and food
Here we go.
series.
Isn't it funny? I don't recognise him from the programmes. You know, isn't it odd? I suddenly thought that's the same person.
Cheery chap. I'm not a doomster at all. But we gave a sort of launch lunch for the hacks who came to the beginning of the programme, and one of the BBC catering staff was heard because we put out all the food that was in the BBC cookbook, which is a very good one. And one of the catering staff said, "Oh, it looks so nice. You'd never know it was healthy."
Yes.
And I think
that's
that
the ticket.
sums up what
That's
we're
the
doing.
I'm a muesli-free area, wholly, and I'm faintly ashamed of it. But the thing is, there's always something slightly more enticing to eat at breakfast. Or, if muesli is the only thing that's on offer, it's dreadfully easy not to eat it at all and get a bit of a virtuous feeling by missing a meal and there.
Binding the internal organs together, I think that the sort of the metaphor is really for this muesli, isn't it? It is the idea that the inside of a person's body flows around, isn't joined, isn't properly
Wallpaper
integrated.
paste, as I say.
Because in the 19th century, it was widely believed that women, the reason that women were inferior to men was because their organs, the internal parts of their body, were less coherent. Thus, hysteria, literally the womb, moved
just
around
wandered
the
about,
empty space.
yes.
And so, therefore, the idea of binding, you know, and then you need for something to bind yourself.
swaddling
It's a
clothes.
wonderful metaphor, and muesli does seem to set the organs together in the way in the old days. I mean, before we used to go out drinking as 17 or 18-year-olds, we always used to go and have 2 or 3 pints of draft Guinness, which it was said provided the foundations for the evening's drinking.
But it
I
does the
think that's
exact
all
opposite, you see,
nonsense, I must
Laurie.
say.
Which one's going to talk?
The idea that muesli binds you, when most of its adherents take it precisely because it does the opposite. It does what all bran used to do. But I think your reference to the 19th century is the key one, that 19th century was a time when people had gargantuan breakfasts, and then they visited the wrath of their indigestion upon their children, if they're clergymen, upon the pupils
It's an
if they were
unpleasant picture
schoolmasters.
you
Yes.
paint.
And I would say the test of your wickedness eating all this stuff isn't really whether you like it. I'm afraid it's what you're like afterwards.
I would hate to intrude upon these fantasies. It does seem to me there's a very good late 20th century reason for eating bran or fibre, or eating it in fruit or in muesli, and that is if you don't want to get cancer of the bowel. I think that's one of the good reasons.
Oh, it's magic.
And
from
it's-
that
yeah,
point of
and
view.
you can-
The mood, but just a minute.
But you can
must
get
get this
away.
straight.
You can-
I want you
yes.
to tell me, Doctor,
Yes.
as I called you resident physician. Muesli may have a bit of bran in it, but it's got a lot of other things like currants and old Swiss herbs and God alone knows what.
Well, you don't need
but it's
bran,
not
you
bran.
see.
A real bran man
you don't
knows
want
it's
bran.
only
Oh, don't say
bran
that,
if it
Michael.
tastes of nothing
don't
or
know,
of
it's not
sawdust
bran.
and is unpleasant to eat.
I want to
Why
keep
eat,
this-
why eat bran? I mean,
Because it's magic, just
no,
like
it
you said.
isn't. Fibre is what you need.
Lift it up from its rather fundamental level, this
in.
discussion,
I
into a
like
more
it. Yes, very
spiritual,
good.
Yes.
spiritual realm.
Get above the
I
muesli
think
belt.
the muesli belt people are urban types or urban transplants, and they have got this romantic idea about what country living is, that it's tremendously healthy, unless, of course, you swallow all the strontium-90 from Sellafield or wherever. And they've got this absolutely wonderful art director's view of what the country is like. I mean, the real country The real country people live on things like dream topping, and they regard fertilizer, obviously, as God's gift to the wheat mountain. And they are never muesli belt people, but people who move into the country and start wearing sort of Oxfam Indian bedspreads and things and having non-nucleaire on their Renault 5s, those people are trying to live an idea of what the countryside is like, and that's why they buy something called muesli, because it's got a Swiss mountain name with a lot of Alps on it.
It's a Guardian reader's specific, no doubt about that. Something else has changed. If you remember in the days of your youth, the health food shop, as it was then called, well, it was on a corner. It was in a very small way of business. It was on a corner along with the shops selling dameroids and trusses, and going into either of those shops, people looked a bit yellow round the gills, and a bit furtive. But now it's exactly as Anne describes it. It's become a big business thing. All the people who go there expect to meet other members of the middle class, their Guardian readers, and it's got a distinctly Laura Ashley feel to it, as once it was strictly the preserve of the truss and elastic leg stocking brigade, wasn't it?
Yeah, I don't think they're anything to do. They've grown away from health completely. I mean, that they're largely to do with paranoia. I mean, I think the people who go there are so determined to fight off evil that's why they go there.
They want to get a packet of paranoia to sprinkle on the muesli. That's right.
In fact, all that people need to do to be healthy is to avoid the big things like the cigarette that Anne's smoking at the moment.
Yes, that is actually a case in point.
To eat some fibre.
I think the muesli in my soul is again a guilt for doing something terribly unhealthy, which is like smoking. So I try and compensate for that. It's like sort of doing a good turn for your wicked private life.
Let us pass on a little. I just want to remind you, because I want to get the quotation in. Do you remember that delightful set of verses? They're far too long to quote here, but I'll give you the first line, by William Plumer, called The Flying Bum, 1944. You remember how they start? At the vegetarian guest house, all was frolic, feast and fun. Eager voices were inquiring, are the nettle cutlets done? Peals of vegetarian laughter, husky, wholesome, wholemeal bread. Will the evening finish with a rush of cocoa to the head? And then, as you remember, after a lot more in the same vein, there's an air raid and a blast from a bomb exploding, as Plumer says, gave this feast its final course, planted bang upon the table a lightly roasted rump of horse. Now, having quoted that, it's a jolly good poem, but those days, the vegetarian jokes of the beachcomber days do ring a little Philistine, I have to admit. So it's certainly time, and more than time, I see by my chronometer, for a song, and that song very deftly combines the subject we've just been discussing with the subject we shall be about to discuss, moral fibre.
It is generally agreed there's a fundamental need to improve the moral fibre of the nation. And with moral bran, we'll purge every wanton sexual urge with family virtues stressed in education.
If you find a girl exciting and her manner is inviting and she's there behind the gym with cheeks aglow, remember, sex turns sour, go straight home and take a shower, play it cool, that's the rule. Say no. Think of the family, what would your mother have to say? She has views you could use since your father packed his bags and went away. If you hold hands during history, exploring fashion's mystery, and you're busy learning lines from Romeo, stop cuddling in the lobby, go and find yourself a hobby. Stop and think, do not shrink, say no.
It is very much the case that our nation's youth now face social standards that are totally amiss. And our hope for girls and boys is family love with all its joys. There must be families somewhere still like this.
If you find her eyes entrancing when you take her disco dancing, and you're worried that your acne cream will show, when your hormones cause you trouble, bringing spots and fluffy stubble, fight the fight, do what's right, say no. Think of the family, what would your father have done? His affairs with au pairs really weren't much fun. When she's with you in French classes and she's making saucy passes, c'est l'amour, she wants you as her beau. You must avoid temptation or accept the aggravation, cut the knot, stop the rot, say no.
It is widely understood moral fibre does you good. The permissive ways provide no social rules. Moral turpitude makes one slothful, dull and rude. It's time to purge all passion from our school. Dirty beasts.
Well, there you had it, and a rather light-hearted way to get into a discussion of one of the words there, moral. We've had the fibre, now we get the moral. And as you know, the House of Lords has tabled an amendment to the Education Act urging that sex education should involve, and this is the phrase, moral considerations. So I just thought I'd ask you, the word moral, along with variants like immoral, moralize, and the plural, morals, does the word moral and its variants make you at all uneasy? Do you tend to resist it? And if so, why?
I think that because it sounds almost something like it was Canetti who said that the name moralist sounds like a perversion. One wouldn't be surprised at finding it suddenly in Kraft Ebbing. And it does. It sounds like a very special sort of person, and people who have morals sound like very special types of people. And so therefore, like, we pull back from the word, and there's no easier way of discomforting somebody than by accusing them of being a moralist. And all of us can, as soon as we think of the word moralist, we think of all those headmasters and preachers. In other words, we think of hypocrisy immediately. We think of people not living by their morals. But the second thing is, I think that it takes, as soon as you use the word morals, and it wasn't a word that was even available. I don't think the word occurs a single time in the Bible or anywhere like that. It wasn't a word that was available until recently. But its availability means that it's a way of talking about some high-flown ideals, which are very much like tablets of stone, which have nothing to do with everyday, with everyday living, with everyday morality. It's the difference almost between like a mathematical propositions, which are those morals which live up there, and the things that we practice but don't preach about, which is a morality which is achieved throughout our life.
It also makes me think of a line from Pygmalion where Colonel Pickering says to Eliza's father, the dustman, "Have you no morals, man?" To which his reply is, "Can't afford them, governor. Neither could you if you was as poor as me." Now, I'm not saying that we have no morals, but to think that you can make a moral statement without taking into account any of the situational variables that can make it sometimes permissible to steal, other times impermissible to steal, to make terrorism sometimes a crime against humanity, then say if it's committed against Hitler, it would be something that would be seen as a stroke to freedom. Anybody who tries to reach out to an objective set of morals and deliberately leaves aside all the other things you've got to talk about as well is simply a fraud, and they make us angry because they're sort of insisting that they know the truth, and that if we dispute it, we have no morals, rather than simply seeing that it's actually more complex than they've ever said.
No, I think it's entirely to do with the word itself. We're very uncomfortable with the word morals because it's associated with moralizing. We are very comfortable, though, if we change that word to ethics. Now, we seem to think it's perfectly okay now to talk about there should be certain ethics in behaviour. There should be ethics in the city. There should be ethics in the medical profession. If we use the word morals, we'd all feel really embarrassed when we start talking about situational and well, perhaps one shouldn't condemn one of those poor doctors you get up and Michael, in front of your star chamber, that particular doctor should not have leapt on that particular lady patient. We say, no, the ethics of the profession say he shouldn't.
I don't think the word matters, actually. I don't think the thing is semantic. I think that it's in the concept of morality that what Laurie was saying that operates. And when we get a frisson out of the concept of morality, it's a marvellous example going on this week in the World Cup, where the excitement comes out of the conflict of the morality. The intrinsic morality of the football is expressed in, well, it's all about winning, isn't it, Brian? That's the intrinsic. But we watch it pretending there is another morality that can be imposed upon this. And we're really watching, if we're honest, I think, a lot of us, because we want a bit of excitement. I gather or a bit of villainy. The euphemism this World Cup is not putting it about, it's called spicy, a bit spicy. And this is because of this interaction of the moralities that we get excited and we watch it.
Well,
Nothing
but
to get the word.
let me put my... I mean, I wouldn't want to subtract a single word from what Laurie said, or indeed from what you've all said. But I do... one I would subtract, and that is, you said you don't think the word matters. I think the word does matter, because really that's what we're getting at. We aren't really getting on about right and wrong, which is a much better version. I know it's 2 words, but it's a much better version than the word moral, because once you use it, and really words like right and wrong and moral need very seldom be uttered, save within the private confines of your own head. And once you start with right and wrong rather than the word moral in your own head, you begin with yourself rather than those comfortable mathematical formulae that Laurie was referring to, which engage the whole of the world. But what makes me... I suppose uneasy and resistant, the words I used at the beginning about the word, this particular word, moral, and its variants, is that it is a public word. It's always used in public. It's used in newspapers, and it's used in radio and television and the House of Parliament and that sort of thing. And it's used... What makes me uneasy is the question mark. It instantly springs in my own mind about the qualifications of those who use it, and I may say, seem to use it so easily. I wonder what their qualifications are, because I know that there are no qualifications. I know that all of us are equally qualified, whether in television studio or saloon bar, and the only possible collateral that could be produced is never produced, because it can't be, is the user's private life.
And I think that it's rather like the criticism that people always make about critics, for example, that a critic should not discuss a play or criticize it because he's not a playwright. He doesn't have the playwriting in his private life, so to speak. He is not qualified. But as Dr. Johnson said, and you would quote this more accurately than me, but in effect what he said is, I don't need to be able to make a table to be able to recognize a bad table.
The real problem is that as somebody said, we've been afflicted on the whole in this century with low-toned moralists. In other words, with moralists who don't think of morals as ideals which could change things around, but think of morals as a reversion to some type of Garden of Eden. So when a politician says, well, we've got to have morals, they're talking about ancient morals, old morals, going backwards. Now, there are also forward morals. I mean, one might want to declare, I want to transform the world in a variety of ways, and these are my new moral ideals. So that's part of the problem.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I wonder if there's a difference, though, between having a moral view and claiming to be a moralist. Now, it seems to me you could very well say that Dickens had a moral view of the 19th century, and it was definitely not the worse for having that. To read his books, you're moved in a way you're simply not moved, say, reading Trollope. What would be different would be if Dickens actually claimed he was a moralist, because then you would look not just to the novels, but to his own life. Now, we all know that Dickens's own life was a horrendous experience for Mrs. Dickens and for the children, and I don't actually think he ever made those particular claims. So I'd say it's moralists that we're worried about, not the actual word moral.
I would return to the public utterance, because the word, I never hear it in private. We're in a sort of, we're playing a game here, we're allowed to utter.
That's why you should leave the word alone a little bit and say, well, where does morality reside? Where does working morality reside?
Well, that is larger than our remit would
oddly
permit.
enough, because working morality resides in things like this conversation, in notions of reciprocity, in queuing, in turn-taking, in making jokes, in politeness. That is the everyday morality in which people observe this, and you can tell that that is a moral area because people's outrage when those things are violated are not sort of outrage. They have not lost any money. Their position has not been threatened, but a taken for granted moral basis of the way in which we get on
behave. Well, if you say this conversation has elements of that, I'm afraid you were a little immoral there, because I was about to say something, but I mean, what you said was
But you
infinitely
felt
more
in
interesting.
your head a minor sense of
But
outrage.
I only wanted to say a very simple thing about the public usage of the thing, and I believe it is only ever used publicly, that public utterance on these matters has been and is currently, and I suspect always will be, if not useless, worse than useless. And if you care to deny that, see Monumentum Requiris, I hope I get the tense right, Circumspice. The state of the world at the moment hasn't altered
No,
very
but
much.
very much a question of the tone of voice, though. I mean, you remember when the Profumo business happened, the Times had a famous leader called "It Is a Moral Issue," which nobody respected because you felt that whoever wrote that editorial had just as many skeletons in his cupboard as poor Profumo ever had. But you take another voice, for example, E.M. Forster, in that essay, What I Believe, written in the middle of the war. He made some intensely personal statements about what he actually thought we were here for and what we should do, what we shouldn't do. But because he made them hesitantly, apologetically, timidly, it was much easier to accept.
There are other places, other than those listed by Laurie, where morality becomes a practical issue. And Anne has referred to one of them already, medical ethics, where, I mean, it comes as a surprise to a lot of people, and even to a lot of doctors, that medical ethics aren't graven upon stone somewhere, or perhaps I should say on tablets with doctors. Over the last 14 years, watching doctors in committees, because they're going to have to pass judgment, as Anne says, eventually, trying to work out a consensus. You find that the consensus evolves really out of a pragmatic response to events. That's essentially what it is. There's an awful lot of self-interest in it, and there's a certain amount of fashion.
Let us consider the children with whom, I should say, we began this with. It would be a fat-headed parent indeed who didn't continuously insist one way or another, and one might hope in the right sort of voice, because I agree with Nicholas, it's got to be the right sort of voice or the right sort of way, on the distinction between right and wrong. If that doesn't happen, nothing is going to happen. But if you preach it to the children, it will be ineffective, because anyone who preaches is self-orientated and immediately seems to be. The only, and this is really, we've touched on this as we've talked, but I think it ought to be put clearly, that anything that falls into the moral category first falls into the utilitarian category. Again, I'm very nearly there. It falls into the utilitarian category. You can simply demonstrate that all sorts of behaviour is strictly and liberally in the interests of the individual and of all individual. And that's why I would say any process of instruction other than that is bound to fail. The consequences of behaviour are to be found in unlimited variety, and they don't have to be preached because they are undeniable. As for honesty, decency, kindness, love, and those things, I'm afraid there is no process of instruction. There is only example. You must give the example or fail to give the example, but that's the only thing you can do.
The fundamental feature of morality. I think this is Nicholas is right, that all morality is contaminated. It is mixed up with all sorts of other obligations. It is, of course, mixed up with self-interest. It's mixed up with cynicism. And that is why the extraction of particular moral arguments by people who claim to have them. I worked on a programme for a time, which is a very, very bad programme called 7 Days. Well, it's probably got very, very good now.
Oh, wait a minute, you might need to work.
I'm certain it's extraordinarily good now, but it was. When I was my part in it, it was a religious programme done by Yorkshire Television. And every week the news item came through and people said, where are the moral issues in this week's news? And we all sat around a table and people said, is this a moral issue? And they said, that looks like the moral issue. And then having sieved, strained political, cultural, religious issues through this sieve of morality, we came out with a thin textured being at the end that I had to sit on a swivel chair and pronounce upon.
Going to this idea that you never preach morality, that you do it by example, this doesn't actually work. For example, I mean, one of the great crises in the au pair owning classes of North London is what to do about Birgitta. Now, usually the au pair owning classes are children of the 60s. They all believed that sexual liberation was a constitutional right, like, the gin and tonic after work and that kind of thing. Then they have children, and then they have Birgitta. And Birgitta, who still believes the 60s view of life, which now the parents don't because they've got children, is dragging roadies from all sorts of punk bands into the spare room. And the nanny owning or the au pair owning classes don't actually want their children to pick up Birgitta's example.
But like all North Londoners, they want it both ways. What they do is fire Birgitta.
So what they do is have terrible guilt if they...
the food of love.
Yes. And then when young Ben or Charlotte or whoever, the little one, says, when I'm older, can I be like Birgitta? They have to say, either way, they throw out Birgitta and get another Birgitta, only this time she's probably even worse. They then have to say, well, Birgitta is that way, but we're not.
I can quite see the dilemma. But the point is, surely you will acknowledge, in your common sense, practical, down-to-earth way, you will recognise that nothing you've ever said to your children in that regard, and possibly many others, has done any good.
No,
whatever.
Bob.
Well,
You should fire the girl and start again, but you won't give her up because it's comfortable.
You can't make moral statements into a vacuum, into the ether. Now, take Anne's situation with Birgitta or any parent's situation with their children. You can actually talk about these things because you know some of the issues involved. But the thing is, you must never be rigid. And the study I was going to refer to is one of those parents who insisted most on good behaviour and laid down the most rigid rules for what you should do and shouldn't do. The children they produced became geniuses at doing the right thing when the parents are watching and then doing the exact opposite when the parents weren't.
Oh, yes.
And the only way to do these things is to talk about them personally on each time they arrive, and also, of course, to set the example.
Well, let me say this. I sound, or at least I was trying to sound, but with small luck, I should think, very cool, balanced, rational, and when I was saying all that about it being first utilitarian, second moral, even Solomon-like.
Yeah.
But really, so what I now have to admit is that if you ever run into any of my children and they say that their father is a ranting, patriarchal, moralising nag, you'll know that they're dreaming. You know it's a figment of their imagination. But really, we're dealing with ideal entities, and they don't exist, do they? But we must use them to talk about
Yes,
it.
and you must admit, though, that this whole idea that you should never moralise about morals, you should just show by your own saintly example, which I'm sure, Bob, is absolutely evident everywhere
that's
in
perfectly plain,
your
obviously.
family. This is nonsense. We seem to think it's perfectly all right to moralise on absolutely everything except morals. We moralise about racism, sexism, ageism.
I've not noticed it around this table.
No, there's not been a lot.
Health food.
Listen, Anne, anyone who goes around talking about right or wrong, except in prophylactic areas like this studio and similar, really is suspect. I mean, if one of you came round and started to instruct me, if ever so slightly, on the moral aspects of my own private behaviour, I'd feel so bad. It would be a monster.
Well, I know, because I know you are deeply
I would sooner
moral.
catch you eating peas off your
If
knife.
I'd happened to have seen you, can I just finish this thing about his
dear.
immorality? I know that you're a moral person, and therefore, of course, you do not need the benefit of my saintly advice. However, if I'd just seen you upending some old lady and snatching her handbag, I would say to you, I think that's wrong, you know.
You'd waste time. You should telephone the police. That's foolish.
That's well.
It's your turn, Michael.
Yes, I mean, precisely, you should phone the police. I think what happens is that, I agree with Bob. By example, the apprenticeship is what people should serve to those who would lead them into a moral life. I think what happens is that people are forced into making judgments. And they make fools of themselves when they make those judgments morally. I thought the test and whatever it is, cricket board with Botham, did exactly this. I mean, once you start judging whether somebody has brought the game into disrepute,
oh yes, that's a lot of cant.
That is a cant, but it gives them a nice moral feeling. They talk about giving an example to the young, and I thought the radio program, the evening news, it's called PM, isn't it? Made a very nice comment because they had this statement from Lords and then followed it up with the Benson and Hedges scores. The same people who were setting an example to the young, supporting, promoting, advertising an addictive drug that causes the premature death of 100,000 people in this country every year.
Anne Leslie, Dr. Michael O'Donnell, Nicholas Tucker and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Instant Sunshine provided the musical interlude and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.